Back in Black. One of the most iconic rock and roll albums in history. You don't need to be an AC/DC fan to have heard a tune or two from this album. If you've ever listened to a radio in your lifetime, chances are you've probably heard at least the title track. But like any great album, this one has its fair share of controversy. And it's all to do with who wrote the lyrics for the Back in Black album, Bon Scott or Brian Johnson. So buckle in and let's go into what I believe is going to be a very intense rabbit hole. And if you love music history like me, make sure to subscribe and join our pack. This video is sponsored by Aura. I've snuck the titles of 7 classic rock albums into the next 60 seconds. See if you can spot them all. In 2023, Americans lost $12.5 billion to online crime. Who's next? It could be you. Don't let your sensitive personal information take a magical mystery tour around the internet. Aura keeps you safe online by doing all the hard work for you. Aura will continuously monitor the dark side of the moon, dark side of the web, and alert you if your information is floating around anywhere it shouldn't be. They're going to let you know faster than a bat out of hell if anybody tries to use this information to access your credit or bank accounts. Plus, they give you up to $5 million in identity theft insurance should you find yourself in dire straits. They also identify data brokers who are selling personal data and submit opt-out requests on your behalf, closing the doors on them. Give Aura a few weeks and you'll stop seeing your information on these sites when you search yourself. It'll also lead to less spam. The rumours are true. You can go to my link, aura.com/musicmongoose to try Aura 14 days absolutely free. Nothing to lose. It's up to us to protect our own data, and Aura helps us do that. In February 1980, AC/DC's iconic vocalist Bon Scott tragically passed away at the age of just 33. The official cause of death was ruled as acute alcohol poisoning. Uncertain of their future without their frontman, it took an intervention from Bon's father to keep the band moving. At Bon's funeral, Chicky took Angus Young aside and gave the band his blessing to continue without his son. Bon would have done the same, Angus said. We felt we had his blessing too. With Chicky's blessing in hand, the band moved back to London, where they were staying at the time, but struggled to produce any music for a while. Still mourning their friend, it would be a couple of weeks before the Young brothers picked up their instruments. And when they did, they started with songs written before Scott's death, which is where the conspiracy begins. Tony Platt, sound engineer of both Highway to Hell and Back in Black, claims both he and producer Robert Mutt Lang heard material from what would become Back in Black prior to Scott's passing. That particular morning is burned into my memory. I was working with Mutt on another album. I was staying at this friend of mine's flat in Kensington, so Mutt was picking me up in his car on the way through to the studio. We actually had started listening to rehearsal demos of songs from the guys, because Back in Black, we already had the plans ready and the studio booked. So we knew that album was about to start. It was the next one we were going to do. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, so let's go back to 1980. The band had exciting new material, but they needed a new frontman to bring it all together. Enter Brian Johnson. Now, I have done another video on this channel which goes into more detail about how Brian Johnson entered AC/DC. You can click up there if you fancy watching that. But to recap, unbeknownst to himself, Johnson was actually top of the list for replacement vocalists, and ironically was introduced to the band through Bon Scott himself. He had mentioned Brian to the other members of the band, having seen him do an incredible impression of Little Richard, who Scott was a huge fan of. And after Bon Scott's death, Brian Johnson's name just kept coming up. Mutt Lang knew of him and recommended him to the band. And even a fan took the time to write in to AC/DC and explain that Brian Johnson would be the best choice for a replacement. Brian was invited to London, and just a couple of auditions later, the deal was done, just 6 weeks after Scott's passing. The band continued working on material for the album, and Brian Johnson was tasked with writing lyrics. In April 1980, they flew to the Bahamas and spent April and May recording at Compass Point Studio. It was produced by Robert Mutt Lang and mixed at Electric Lady Studios in New York. So at this point, AC/DC had a new singer, they had new material, and they were ready to record their new album. But was it really new? For decades now, debate has raged between fans over how much of the material has Bon Scott's blueprints on it, if any. Online forums are basically split into two camps. Those who say Bon Scott wrote most of the lyrics to Back in Black, and those who say he didn't. The main arguments for Bon Scott writing most of the Back in Black album are to do with interviews and articles from people close to the band. More on that in a minute. Many also point out that Back in Black feels and sounds much more like a Bon Scott album from a lyrical perspective, rather than the style of Brian Johnson. Some even claim that AC/DC used Bon Scott's material as far as their Flick of the Switch album, which came out 3 years after Back in Black. On the other side of the argument, fans say that AC/DC would never do something like that to Bon Scott. And the band have chosen for the most part not to engage in these theories. So let's take a little look at these theories, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. Comment down below with what you think. Now, as I mentioned before, there is some compelling evidence to the claims. Sound engineer Tony Platt claimed that he and the album's producer had heard demo tapes with some of the songs that would become Back in Black, and they knew that the album was in the works before the addition of Brian Johnson. Now, this doesn't necessarily prove that Bon Scott wrote the album's lyrics, but there's more light to be shed from this angle. Some accounts claim that one of the tracks the Young brothers worked on before the addition of Brian Johnson featured Bon Scott playing drums in a rough demo. And Angus Young himself has admitted that Bon Scott does play the drums in early demos for Hell's Bells and Have a Drink on Me. Simon Wright agrees with this too. You know what's funny is Angus played me a tape one time when I was at his house in Holland and there was no vocal on it, but it was Bon playing drums to the riff of Back in Black. It was a pretty straightforward beat, but it had a good feel to it. I'm sure it would have sounded awesome if Bon sang on the Back in Black album. Unfortunately, we'll never know. And as far as I can tell, these early recordings of Bon playing the drums don't exist anywhere on the internet. Now, as I said, accounts like this don't necessarily prove anything, but they do add some weight to the story. And another theory actually comes from my own comment section. Some of you suggested that the lyrics for Back in Black came from Bon Scott's notebook. And some theories state that Ian Jeffrey, the band's former manager, was at some point in possession of this notebook after Bon's death. A book called AC/DC Shock to the System by Mark Putterford may be able to shed some light. He quotes Jeffrey directly. You've got to give Mutt Lange a lot of credit there for writing most of the stuff at Compass Point. Malcolm and Angus obviously pitched in a lot, but I heard that a lot of it was Mutt. The author then asks Ian Jeffrey if there was a notebook of Bon Scott's lyrics. Yeah, well, I wouldn't say it was a notebook, it was just scraps of paper. Of course, it wasn't Back in Black or anything then. Many people have argued that Back in Black sounds more like the lyrics of Scott than Johnson. Scott was known for his double entendre, simple rhyme schemes, and tongue-in-cheek humour, which are all abundant in Back in Black. Have a look at these lyrics from Highway to Hell, released 1979. Livin' easy, lovin' free, season ticket on a one-way ride, askin' nothin', leave me be, taking everything in my stride. Don't need reason, don't need rhyme, ain't nothing I'd rather do, going down, party time, my friends are gonna be there too. And these lyrics from Back in Black, released 1980. Back in Black, I hit the sack. I've been too long, I'm glad to be back. Yes, I'm let loose from the noose that's kept me hanging about. I've been looking at the sky, cause it's getting me high. Forget the hearse, cause I never die. I got 9 lives, cat's eyes. Abusing every one of them and running wild. It's easy to see the similarities there, isn't it? But some of you have of course argued that they don't sound alike at all. And a lot of people argue that Bon Scott's songs feature a beginning, a middle, and an end, whereas with Brian Johnson, his lyrics are descriptive one-liners throughout. For his part, Angus Young has commented that, from a musical point of view, the difference mainly was that Bon leaned very hard on rhythm when he sang. Johnson preferred to spout his lyrics with a more punchy delivery and was less concerned with the song's rhythm. Now for me, Bon was probably one of the most underrated lyricists, even though you could say things like "she's got the balls, she's got the jack" were gutter lyrics. For me, they were poetry, and he used to call it poetry too. Toilet poetry. He also said in the same interview, Bon's was more subtle. You'd wonder what he was talking about, and half an hour later you'd be rolling with laughter when you finally got it. Brian's just as clever, but his humour is more direct. You catch it straight away. And it's not just fans who have been sucked into this drama, professional musicians have weighed in too. Ugly Kid Joe singer Whitfield Crane admitted to hearing some unmistakable Bon Scottisms throughout Back in Black. Scott Ian told me once that he was talking to producer Eddie Kramer, and Eddie Kramer told him that he had heard a bunch of Back in Black songs with Bon on it. I'm curious to know if that's true because the lyrics are so Bon Scottish. And on Back in Black, Rock and Roll Ain't Noise Pollution, I listen to it and I go, I bet Bon wrote this. And when you look at lyrics from later work such as Blow Up Your Video, the last album Johnson contributed lyrics to before the Young brothers took the reins, there is arguably a different feel there. However, as I said, none of this really proves anything. The fact that there are similarities in a band's discography isn't exactly surprising. They are a band with a signature sound, a reputation, and a huge fan base that know what they want to listen to. Consistency sells. If you look at choruses from their entire career, the blueprint is pretty much the same. Big, punchy, simple hooks you can sing along to. And of course, that doesn't mean that Bon Scott wrote every AC/DC song ever, does it? Brian Johnson himself has denied the rumours in his autobiography. Every now and again a fan would come up and say, this guy's saying this, and factually it wasn't true. There wasn't an internet then, it didn't really get further than Australia. But I thought it was awful, I had to explain myself, and that's why in the book I went once and for all. I want to put this baby to bed. He's also said, I remember every detail of doing that album. And there's also the band's integrity to consider, because these rumours don't exactly put the band in a good light. On Back in Black, the writing credits are dedicated to Angus Young, Malcolm Young, and Brian Johnson. And simply put, why would they lie about that? Bon Scott was their friend, and his passing hurt them. Angus Young said that losing him was like losing a family member. Why then would they take his work and then claim it as their own, or deny his involvement? I suppose you could argue legal complications and matters to do with crediting, but for me that alone is enough to prove that the band wouldn't have done that. And at the end of the day, we may never know the exact story, and doubtless more theories and info will come out over the years, but what is certain is that it's a fascinating story of an iconic album. And let's remember as well, the album is called Back in Black, something many feel is symbolic of a funeral. Especially the title track itself seems to be a direct mourning of Bon Scott. And all of that is explained in this video. Go watch it next.